Breaking news out of Ottawa and what just unfolded in the past 72 hours represents one of the most catastrophic financial escalations in modern North American history. Canada has initiated a massive liquidation of United States Treasury bonds, dumping $450 billion worth of securities in what economists are calling a calculated financial warfare move that has sent shockwaves through global markets. We're not talking about minor portfolio adjustments. We're talking about the second largest foreign holder of US debt suddenly flooding the market with bonds, interest rates spiking by 47 basis points in a single trading session, and the Federal Reserve calling an emergency closed-door meeting for the first time since the 2008 financial crisis. The ripple effects are already devastating. Mortgage rates jumped to 8.3% overnight. Municipal bond markets are in free fall. Pension funds holding Treasury securities just lost $62 billion in value within 48 hours. In the next 18 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney orchestrated this financial retaliation, who's paying the real price as American families watch their retirement accounts evaporate, and why Federal Reserve economists warn this could trigger a liquidity crisis that makes 2008 look manageable. The question everyone's asking: how did we go from the world's most stable bond market to the brink of a sovereign debt crisis? Let me be crystal clear about what we're witnessing. This isn't just another trade dispute. This is financial Armageddon being deployed as a diplomatic weapon, and the timeline of how we got here reveals a pattern of escalation that should terrify every American watching their savings. Let me paint you the picture of what just happened. On January 24, 2025, the Bank of Canada issued what appeared to be a routine quarterly portfolio rebalancing notice. But buried in the technical language was a bombshell. Canada would be liquidating its entire $450 billion position in United States Treasury securities over a 90-day window. Not reducing, not adjusting, liquidating completely. By January 27th, the first wave hit. $75 billion worth of 10-year Treasury bonds flooded the market in a coordinated morning dump that caught New York traders completely off guard. The yield on the 10-year Treasury, which had been sitting comfortably at 4.1%, spiked to 4.57% within 6 hours of trading. To put that in perspective, that's the largest single-day move in Treasury yields since March 2020, when COVID lockdowns triggered global panic. But this didn't happen in a vacuum. This is the latest and most devastating escalation in a trade war that's been building since President Trump imposed his 75% tariff on all Canadian imports on December 15, 2024. To understand how we got here, you need to know that Canada has been America's third largest foreign creditor behind Japan and China. $450 billion in Treasury holdings represents approximately 8.7% of all foreign-held U.S. debt. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, this level of coordinated selling by a major ally is unprecedented in modern financial history. Their research shows that even during the most heated moments of US-China trade tensions in 2018 and 2019, Beijing never dumped more than $30 billion in treasuries in any single quarter. Canada is moving 15 times that amount. By early January 2025, the warning signs were everywhere but largely ignored. Trade tensions had already pushed the Canadian dollar to historic lows against the greenback. Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland publicly stated on January 8th that Ottawa was exploring all available economic countermeasures to Trump's tariff regime. Behind closed doors, according to sources at the Bank of Canada who spoke to Bloomberg on condition of anonymity, Carney's government had been quietly preparing this financial strike for weeks. Then came the trigger event. On January 20th, Trump expanded his tariff policy to include a blanket 35% levy on all financial services imports, effectively targeting Canada's banking sector. The Toronto Stock Exchange lost 11% of its value in a single trading day. Canadian pension funds, heavily invested in cross-border financial instruments, faced catastrophic losses. Mark Carney, facing mounting political pressure and an economy teetering on recession, authorized what his advisors are calling the nuclear option. And it gets worse. The Federal Reserve, caught completely flat-footed by Canada's move, called an emergency Federal Open Market Committee meeting for January 28th at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. This meeting wasn't on any scheduled calendar. According to Federal Reserve sources who spoke to the Wall Street Journal, Chairman Jerome Powell personally called every FOMC member at home late on January 27th using language described as urgent and unprecedented. The last time the Fed convened an unscheduled emergency session was September 15, 2008, the day Lehman Brothers collapsed. On January 27th alone, the bond market carnage was extraordinary. The iShares 20-plus-year Treasury bond ETF, a bellwether for long-term government debt, dropped 7.8%. That's a nearly 8% loss in a security that's supposed to be the safest investment in the world. Insurance companies holding Treasury bonds as reserve requirements reported mark-to-market losses totaling $43 billion. State pension funds from California to New York saw their supposedly risk-free Treasury holdings crater in value. But here's what makes this different from previous Treasury sell-offs. When China reduced its holdings in 2016 and 2019, they did it gradually over quarters and years, allowing markets to absorb the supply. Canada is carpet-bombing the bond market, with selling pressure at a pace that's overwhelming normal market mechanisms. There simply aren't enough buyers to absorb $450 billion in treasuries over 90 days without interest rates spiking to levels that could trigger a full-blown debt crisis. So how exactly does this financial weapon work? And why is it backfiring against American families so spectacularly? Let me break this down in simple terms. Think of United States Treasury bonds like the foundation of the entire American financial system. Every mortgage rate, every car loan, every credit card interest rate is built on top of what Treasuries yield. When a major holder like Canada dumps $450 billion worth of these bonds onto the market, it's like suddenly flooding the market with supply while demand stays the same. Basic economics tells us what happens next. Prices fall, and when bond prices fall, yields rise. And when Treasury yields rise, every single borrowing cost in America rises with them. Here's the mechanism creating this crisis, step by step. First, Canada sells $75 to $100 billion in treasuries per week. Second, bond dealers and institutional investors who buy these bonds demand higher yields to compensate for the risk of catching a falling knife. Third, those higher yields immediately translate into higher interest rates across the entire economy. Fourth, American consumers and businesses face dramatically increased borrowing costs virtually overnight. Fifth, the Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice. They can either let interest rates spike and risk triggering a recession, or they can step in and buy the bonds themselves, essentially printing money and risking runaway inflation. But here's the kicker. The Federal Reserve has been trying to reduce its own balance sheet for the past 2 years, selling off the treasuries it bought during COVID-19 emergency interventions. They've been moving at a pace of about $95 billion per quarter. Now Canada is dumping $75 billion per week. The Fed would have to completely reverse course, halt all quantitative tightening, and potentially restart quantitative easing just to stabilize markets. According to economists at the Brookings Institution, if the Fed absorbs all $450 billion of Canadian selling, it would undo 24 months of balance sheet reduction in just 3 months. That's a staggering policy reversal that would signal to markets that the central bank has lost control of monetary policy. And it gets worse. Here's what they're not telling you. When Treasury yields spike this dramatically, it doesn't just affect new borrowing. It affects the value of existing bonds held by every institution in America. Banks hold treasuries as Tier 1 capital. Insurance companies hold them as reserves against policy claims. Pension funds hold them as safe assets to match long-term liabilities. Money market funds hold them as cash equivalents. When a 10-year treasury loses 7% of its value in a week, every institution holding that bond just took a massive loss. Yale Budget Lab economists calculate that the total mark-to-market losses across the US financial system from Canada's selling could exceed $800 billion if the liquidation continues at current pace. The data shows us exactly who's absorbing these losses right now. Commercial banks reported $62 billion in unrealized losses on Treasury holdings in their January 28th Securities and Exchange Commission filings. That's actual money disappearing from bank balance sheets. Regional banks, which were already struggling after the March 2023 banking crisis, are particularly vulnerable. Silicon Valley Bank collapsed partially because rising interest rates destroyed the value of their Treasury portfolio. Now we're seeing the same pattern accelerated. Three regional banks, First Republic of Ohio, Cascade National Bank in Washington, and Pinnacle Community Bank in Texas, have already restricted customer withdrawals citing liquidity concerns related to Treasury market volatility. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation examiners are conducting emergency stress tests at 47 regional and community banks as of January 28th. Let me introduce you to some of the real people whose lives are being destroyed by this financial warfare. Robert Mitchell, a 63-year-old machinist from Youngstown, Ohio, spent 37 years working at a steel fabrication plant, contributing diligently to his company's pension fund. That pension fund, like most American defined benefit plans, holds approximately 40% of its assets in United States Treasury bonds for stability and safety. On January 27th, Robert received an emergency notification from his pension administrator. The fund's asset value had dropped 11.3% in 72 hours due to Treasury market losses. His monthly pension payment, which was supposed to be $3,200 starting this February when he retires, has been reduced to $2,780. That's a 13% cut before he's even received his first check. Robert and his wife Linda had budgeted everything around that $3,200 monthly income. Their mortgage payment is $1,400. Their health insurance, since Robert is retiring before Medicare eligibility, is $970 monthly. Add utilities, food, and car insurance, and they had about $200 of breathing room each month. Now they're $420 short every single month. Robert faces an impossible choice: delay retirement and keep working despite chronic back pain that makes standing for 8-hour shifts excruciating, or retire as planned and start draining his personal savings, a $58,000 nest egg he'd hoped would cover emergencies and provide a small inheritance for his daughter. At $420 per month shortfall, that savings will be completely gone in 11 years. Robert is 63. His father lived to 87. Do the math. Linda told me through tears during our phone interview that they've already started cutting prescription medications in half to save money. Robert's blood pressure medication costs $130 per month, even with insurance. They're now taking it every other day instead of daily. That's the choice they're making, because Canada decided to weaponize Treasury bonds. Multiply Robert Mitchell's story by millions. The National Association of State Retirement Administrators reports that public pension funds across America hold approximately $1.4 trillion in United States Treasury securities. If those bonds lose an average of 8% of their value, we're talking about $112 billion in losses hitting pension funds that are already underfunded by an estimated $1.3 trillion nationwide. According to actuaries at Milliman Consulting, if these Treasury losses aren't recovered within the next 6 months, at least 37 state and municipal pension systems will be forced to cut benefits, increase employee contributions, or both. Jennifer Torres, a 47-year-old high school teacher in Sacramento, California, contributes $800 per month to the California State Teachers Retirement System. CalSTRS sent an emergency memo to all members on January 28th, warning that investment losses may require a 2.5% increase in employee contribution rates starting next fiscal year. For Jennifer, that means an additional $43 per paycheck, or about $93 per month. She's a single mother with 2 teenage daughters. Her take-home pay after taxes and current retirement contribution is $4,100 monthly. Rent in Sacramento for a 3-bedroom apartment is $2,700. After utilities, car payment, insurance, and groceries, Jennifer has roughly $300 left for everything else: gas, clothing, school expenses, any emergency that pops up. An extra $93 per month might not sound devastating to a policymaker in Washington, but to Jennifer, it's catastrophic. It's the difference between making it and not making it. And it gets worse. Jennifer refinanced her mortgage in 2023 at 6.8%, thankful she'd locked in a rate before they climbed higher. Now, with Treasury yields spiking, mortgage rates hit 8.3% on January 28th. Jennifer had been considering refinancing again if rates dropped, maybe freeing up $150 per month. That option is gone. Actually, it's worse than gone. If she'd waited another month to refinance in 2023, she'd be paying 8.3% now instead of 6.8%. That would cost her an extra $430 per month. She got lucky by accident. Millions of Americans waiting to buy homes or refinance are facing these devastating new rates right now. Thomas and Patricia Hua, both in their early 60s, were 30 days away from closing on their retirement condo in Fort Myers, Florida. They'd sold their home in Michigan, packed up their lives, and were moving to warmer weather for their golden years. Their mortgage approval was locked at 7.1% for a $400,000 loan. That's a monthly payment of about $2,670. On January 29, their lender called with devastating news. Due to extreme Treasury market volatility, the bank was invoking a market disruption clause in the loan agreement. The new rate would be 8.6%, or the loan would be cancelled. 8.6% on $400,000 is a monthly payment of $3,095. That's $425 more per month, or $5,100 more per year, every single year, for 30 years. Thomas and Patricia had budgeted to the penny. Their combined Social Security and pension income is $6,100 monthly. After the $2,670 mortgage payment they'd expected, they'd have $3,430 for everything else: healthcare, food, utilities, property taxes, condo fees. It was tight but workable. At the new $3,095 payment, they'd have only $3,005 left. That's not enough. The condo association fees alone are $410 monthly. Their Medicare supplement and prescription drug coverage is $670 combined. That leaves them $1,925 for property taxes, utilities, food, car insurance, gas, and every other expense. In Florida, where property insurance has skyrocketed. They called me from a hotel room in Fort Myers where they're staying temporarily. Everything they own is in a storage unit. Their closing has been delayed indefinitely while they scramble to figure out what to do. Patricia kept saying she just wants to understand how this happened. They followed all the rules, saved for 40 years, did everything right, and now their retirement dream is collapsing because of a trade war they didn't even know was happening. Multiply Thomas and Patricia's story by hundreds of thousands of Americans. The Mortgage Bankers Association reports that approximately 380,000 purchase mortgage applications were in process as of January 27th. Real estate agents across the country are reporting that roughly 40% of those deals are now at risk of falling through due to rate increases that have pushed buyers' debt-to-income ratios above lending thresholds. That's 152,000 families whose home purchases are suddenly in jeopardy. But here's what really concerns financial analysts and what should keep every American up at night. This is just the beginning. Canada has only liquidated $75 billion so far. They have $375 billion more to dump over the next 11 weeks. Federal Reserve economists who spoke to Bloomberg under strict anonymity used the phrase existential threat to describe the scenario if Canada follows through with the full liquidation. According to their internal models, if Treasury yields continue rising at the current pace, we could see the 10-year yield hit 5.8% by mid-March. At those levels, the average 30-year mortgage rate would exceed 9.5%. That would effectively freeze the entire U.S. housing market. No one could afford to buy. No one could afford to refinance. Home values would plummet as desperate sellers try to find buyers in a market with 9+% financing costs. Goldman Sachs credit analysts published a research note on January 29th outlining a nightmare scenario they're calling the sovereign debt spiral. Here's how it works. Higher Treasury yields mean higher government borrowing costs. The United States has $34.7 trillion in national debt. Every single dollar of that debt will eventually need to be rolled over at these higher rates. If the average interest rate on U.S. debt increases from 3.3% currently to 5.5%, the annual interest expense on the national debt would jump from approximately $1.1 trillion to $1.9 trillion. That's an additional $800 billion per year in interest costs alone. $800 billion that has to come from somewhere, either higher taxes, deeper spending cuts to Social Security and Medicare, or more borrowing, which creates even more interest costs. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent held an emergency press conference on January 29th, carefully reading from prepared remarks that tried to project calm while the panic was visible in his eyes. He assured markets that the United States government remains committed to meeting all debt obligations and that Treasury auctions will continue as scheduled. What he didn't say was equally telling. He didn't say yields would stabilize. He didn't say Canada would reverse course. He didn't say the Fed had a plan to contain the damage. According to sources at the Treasury Department who spoke to the Financial Times, internal modeling shows that if Canada completes its $450 billion liquidation and other foreign holders follow suit, the US could face its first failed Treasury auction since the 1970s. That means the government tries to sell bonds and doesn't find enough buyers at any price. If that happens, it would represent a complete collapse of confidence in United States sovereign debt. Economists at the International Monetary Fund released a rushed analysis on January 30th that should terrify policymakers. They calculate that for every 1 percentage point increase in Treasury yields, the United States economy loses approximately $1.2 trillion in economic output over 18 months through reduced consumption, reduced business investment, and wealth effects from declining asset values. We've already seen a 0.47 percentage point increase in the 10-year yield in just 5 days. That translates to roughly $560 billion in lost GDP over the next year and a half. If yields continue rising to the 5.8% level that Fed models predict, we're looking at $2 trillion in lost economic output. That's larger than the entire economies of Italy or Canada. The European Central Bank, watching this catastrophe unfold, issued its own emergency statement on January 30th. ECB President Christine Lagarde warned that a United States sovereign debt crisis would trigger immediate contagion across European bond markets and could force the ECB to implement emergency liquidity measures to prevent a repeat of the 2011 Eurozone crisis. Translation: this isn't just an American problem anymore. This is a global financial crisis in its early stages. Let me be crystal clear about the timeline of consequences here. In the next 30 to 90 days, we're going to see continued selling pressure from Canada, overwhelming bond markets. Mortgage rates likely climbing above 9%, effectively freezing the housing market. Regional banks facing liquidity crises as depositors panic, and credit card companies raising rates to 15 to 18% or higher as their own borrowing costs spike. In 6 to 12 months, corporate bankruptcies will accelerate as companies can't refinance debt at sustainable rates. Unemployment will rise as businesses cut investment and hiring. State and local governments will face budget crises as their borrowing costs explode, and pension funds will announce benefit cuts affecting millions of retirees. But here's what really concerns analysts: the permanent damage to America's credibility as a safe haven for global capital. For 75 years, United States Treasury bonds have been considered the safest investment in the world, the bedrock of the global financial system. That reputation is built on trust. Trust that America pays its debts. Trust that Treasury bonds are liquid and stable. Trust that holding dollars and dollar-denominated assets is fundamentally safe. Canada just shattered that trust. And if one of America's closest allies can weaponize treasuries as a retaliatory tool in a trade dispute, why would any other foreign government feel secure holding U.S. debt? Japan holds $1.1 trillion in treasuries. China holds $780 billion. The United Kingdom holds $690 billion. If even a fraction of these holders decide to reduce their positions out of concern that they could be next, we could see a cascade of selling that no intervention can stop. Research from the Council on Foreign Relations warns that once foreign confidence in U.S. treasuries erodes, it's nearly impossible to restore. They cite the British pound's loss of reserve currency status after World War II as a historical parallel. Once global markets lose faith in a currency's stability, the shift to alternatives accelerates rapidly and often irreversibly. Nouriel Roubini, the NYU economist who predicted the 2008 financial crisis, published an op-ed in the Financial Times on January 31st with a stark warning. He argues we're witnessing the beginning of the end of dollar hegemony. In his assessment, Trump's aggressive trade policies have given China and other rivals the perfect excuse to accelerate their de-dollarization efforts. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have been discussing alternatives to dollar-based trade for years. Canada's Treasury dump provides the catalyst for those discussions to become concrete action. If the BRICS countries collectively reduce their dollar reserve holdings by even 20%, Rubini calculates it would trigger a dollar devaluation of 15 to 20% and push Treasury yields above 7%. At that point, the United States government would be spending more on interest payments than on defense. Lawrence Summers, former Treasury Secretary and Harvard economist, gave a closed-door briefing to congressional leaders on February 1st. According to lawmakers who attended and spoke to Politico afterward, Summers laid out a scenario he called the unraveling. In this scenario, Canada's selling triggers broader foreign liquidation of treasuries, yields spike above 6%, the housing market collapses, regional banks fail, triggering a credit crunch, corporations default on debt obligations, unemployment surges above 8%, and the Federal Reserve is forced to choose between hyperinflation through unlimited money printing or a depression through allowing deflation and mass bankruptcies. Summers reportedly told the room that we have perhaps 60 days to prevent this outcome through a dramatic de-escalation of trade tensions with Canada. After that, market momentum becomes unstoppable. Let's recap the three critical points here. First, who's paying the price for this financial warfare? It's not policymakers in Washington or Ottawa. It's Robert Mitchell watching his pension evaporate after 37 years of work. It's Jennifer Torres facing contribution increases she can't afford. It's Thomas and Patricia Hua watching their retirement dream collapse in a Florida hotel room. It's millions of American families who did everything right and are now being crushed by forces completely beyond their control. Second, the scale of this crisis is almost incomprehensible. $450 billion in forced selling. $2 trillion in potential lost economic output, mortgage rates approaching 10%, 150,000 home purchases at risk of collapse, pension losses exceeding $100 billion. These aren't hypothetical numbers. This is happening right now as you watch this video. Third, the permanent consequence that should terrify every American. We are witnessing the potential collapse of the United States dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. Once that credibility is gone, once foreign governments decide that holding U.S. Treasury bonds is a political risk rather than a safe haven investment, no policy change will reverse that perception. The damage is permanent. If this concerns you, if you want to understand the full scope of how trade policy is destroying American financial stability, hit that subscribe button. I'm breaking down these economic catastrophes as they unfold in real time. Thanks for watching. Here's what keeps me up at night. We're not just losing $450 billion in bond sales. We're losing something far more valuable than money. We're losing the trust and credibility that took 75 years to build. The trust that made the United States dollar the foundation of global commerce. The credibility that allowed American families to borrow at the lowest rates in the world. Once that trust is shattered, once foreign governments see Treasury bonds as political weapons rather than safe investments, no amount of intervention will bring it back. And that loss will echo through American prosperity for generations.